Welcome to Season 4 of Far Reach Voyages, where we share our love of sailing and adventure travel. In the last episode, I described several modifications I made to the Far Reach during and after installing the Beta diesel engine and folding propeller in our previously engine-free boat. Several of the mods were the addition of a Raymarine depth sounder using a transducer that didn't require a hole to be drilled in the hull, a more capable but still simple solar system, a larger battery bank, and LED navigation lights to replace our oil lamps which had worked so well for us. I also designed and installed a new style pram hood. The episode concluded with the Far Reach relaunch just weeks before my planned departure across the potentially dangerous Gulf Stream as part of our 1,500 nautical mile voyage back to the Virgin Islands. However, I still had to figure out what was causing our Cape Horn wind vane to suddenly perform poorly in light wind. Without a perfectly performing wind vane, there could be no single-handed sailing. For those familiar with our 6-year rebuild and subsequent offshore voyages, you will recall the Cape Horn wind vane has been a workhorse, making short-handed and especially single-handed voyaging possible. I literally don't touch the tiller from the time I leave Beaufort, North Carolina, till I arrive in the Virgin Islands 12 days later. Best of all, the wind vane does not cost us 1 amp of battery power. It's totally powered by the wind and water. It's a very clever and simple design. Yves Jelena, the designer and builder of the Cape Horn wind vane, used a prototype on his Alberg 30 Jean Dusud for a one-stop circumnavigation via the Roaring Forties, including doubling the Horn in the early 1980s. It's a proven design, steering hundreds of boats all over the world. While there are probably a half a dozen different brands of self-steering wind vanes that have various degrees of effectiveness, I'm quite happy with the Cape Horn. The Cape Horn wind vane model I use, called the Jean Dusud, is more invasive than other vanes, which normally bolt onto the transom and run the control lines over the deck to the tiller or wheel. However, my vane requires a hole cut into the transom. This puts the vane quadrant in the lazarette, which takes up a little space, but gives the vane its elegant, low profile and streamlined appearance. Mounted this way, the control lines can be run under the deck and then through the original wheel steering quadrant mounted on the rudder post, which gives it exceptional power. The control lines exit in the front of the cockpit just below the traveler and easy to engage and disengage. When I converted the Far Reach from wheel to tiller steering, I left the quadrant on the rudder post for just this reason. Anyway, Cape Horn does offer a vane that doesn't require a hole to be cut in the transom, so you can achieve the same Cape Horn performance with a bolt-on vane. The bottom line is, without the wind vane, which requires no electricity to operate, I'd have to hand steer the boat, and that's not practicable single-handing. Sailors that don't rely on a self-steering wind vane use an electric autopilot, or they have plenty of crew to take turns. Some boats, maybe even most boats, have an electric autopilot. While convenient, it's a complex piece of equipment, and as such can be troublesome. It uses a fair amount of electricity to operate, which I can't produce with my simple solar system. It's also noisy and expensive. It's just not something I want on my simple, uncomplicated, rugged boat. During the second voyage home from the Virgin Islands, before I installed the engine, the wind vane began to exhibit 2 symptoms. The first was a tendency for the servo blade, which provides mechanical leverage to move the tiller back and forth steering the boat, to trip or fold at the breakaway coupling when encountering large amounts of sargassum seaweed. The second problem is the vane began to have trouble steering the boat in light wind, an area of performance which has always been one of its strengths. The area of the Atlantic Ocean I sail through on the way to the Virgin Islands is called the Sargasso Sea, and it's filled with a brown seaweed called sargassum. It has air sacs and floats on the surface of the water. And while sargassum has always been there, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a dramatic increase in the amount of sargassum in the Atlantic and Caribbean. I've seen blankets of it hundreds of yards long and wide, like a giant floating brown carpet. If you're unfamiliar with sargassum, I recommend a quick internet search, and you'll see dramatic photos that will lead you to quickly understand the scope of the problem and the challenge faced by my wind vane. At one time, sargassum was mostly contained in the area I showed on the map. but now it's found in a belt 5,000 miles long, stretching from the Atlantic off the west coast of Africa all the way across the Caribbean to the Yucatan in Mexico. The solution to the first problem, the tripping of the servo blade, wasn't too difficult. The issue is the coupling's built around a simple breakaway system incorporating pins, slots, and a shock cord. The pins on the pendulum arm fit into slots in the stainless steel bracket at the top of the servo blade. The shock cord holds them together. If the servo blade makes contact with something in the water, the shock cord stretches and the pins slide out of the slots and the servo folds back in the water, preventing damage. It's a very simple system with nothing to break. The solution is straightforward. First, I make sure the shock cord is new before each offshore voyage. Second, I have experimented by increasing the shock cord diameter from 1/4 inch to 5/16 with some improvement. Third, and most important, I carefully file the notches the pins fit into deeper incrementally until the blade stops detaching. The drawback, of course, is there is a chance the hinge won't fold if the blade hits something hard in the water. But with a full keel boat, the chance of that is probably not too likely, but there is still some risk. Some people have said the servo blade needs a different breakaway hinge design. Maybe so, but I think it's easier said than done, as the entire vane is a holistic engineered system and has in all other ways performed exceptionally well. I have to think it's likely a problem unique to the Sargasso Sea where I'm presently sailing. If you have a Cape Horn vane and you've experienced a similar problem and developed a solution, let us know in the comment section. The second problem was much more vexing than a detaching servo blade. One of the things I really like about the Cape Horn wind vane is how accurate it steers the boat. It doesn't matter if we're working upwind in 35 knots and 10-foot seas or ghosting along downwind in a zephyr. If there's enough wind to move the ear blade, the vane will steer the boat. Unlike some other vanes which sometimes have a tendency to steer a zigzag course, on the far reach the Cape Horn steers the boat like a laser beam, just as straight as can be with very little wandering other than that caused by wind shifts. So this loss of light air steering accuracy was troubling, and it got worse over time. While I was installing the engine, I took the vane off the boat and took it home to my shop. I cleaned it carefully and greased a few moving parts I could access and reinstalled it. I figured it probably just needed a good cleaning. When we relaunched the boat in June, after installing the engine, I realized I had a bigger issue. It was still not working, and in fact it got worse. We hauled the boat out in August 2021 as part of our hurricane mitigation plan, and I brought the vane back home and into the shop. By now, I was corresponding with both Yves and his nephew Eric, who builds the vanes. They were responsive as always and gave me a few ideas. I decided to take the vane completely apart. There's not much to disassemble. Once I had the parts on the table, I was stunned by how simple it really is. I'd watched it work for hundreds of hours. I understood the principle of how it worked, but I didn't know how simple and perfectly engineered it is till I had it apart. I've seen vanes with all kinds of linkages and gears and moving parts and dissimilar metals. But the Cape Horn has one metal, a couple linkages, some UHMW bushings, and no gears. I also finally understood the magic and strength of the Z-Rod. You may think I'm being over the top when I say it, but it's a genius design. There's not much to go wrong. It's like the AK-47 of wind vanes. But why had its performance begun to deteriorate in light wind? At this point, I was ready to try anything. Yves suggested I could try an adjustment to the blade's alignment, which I did, and see if it solved the problem. Then I reinstalled the vane. We relaunched the Far Reach on 17 November 2021. I was planning on departing for the West Indies in less than 2 weeks. With the boat in the water, Gail and I tested the vane in a light breeze. There was no improvement. So I made a video of the vane unable to hold course in light air, and I sent it to Yves. In the video, I mentioned it was as if the vane was trying to steer the boat in one direction. It should be aligned with the wind right now, but it wants to come this way. Again, it's kind of like, I don't know, the shape of the blade is causing the oar to steer to one side or something. It just doesn't seem to be responding right. His immediate response was like being struck by lightning. I should have figured it out in 5 minutes on my own, like Occam's razor. He told me to take the servo blade off and look down the teak blade and see if it was warped. I knew what I was going to see even before I looked. Sure enough, it was warped about 3/8 of an inch over its length. Essentially, the servo was trying to turn the boat and was overcoming the input from the air blade in light wind. In higher wind, the air blade was effective in controlling the servo. I took the servo blade home. It took me about 30 minutes to plane the blade straight with a hand smoothing plane, continually checking it against a straight edge. Then I took the servo blade back to the boat, and we took her out in a light, early evening breeze. She steered perfectly. I was elated. One of the contributing factors is I had left the teak servo blade bare rather than varnish or paint it as Cape Horn recommends. I must have slept through that class. So I think it just warped over time as a result of being in and out of the water for long periods of time, and I never noticed. With the vane steering perfectly again, Gale and I provisioned the boat in preparation for my 1,500-mile single-handed voyage back to the Virgin Islands. Then we sailed her down the ICW about 30 miles and anchored off the town waterfront in Beaufort, North Carolina, to wait for a weather window. But there were more difficulties ahead, and time was running out for suitable weather to make a safe crossing of the dangerous Gulf Stream before the winter storm season arrived. But if you want to find out what happened, you'll have to join us for the next episode of Far Reach Voyages. If you enjoyed this episode of Far Reach Voyages, let us know in the comments. Also, consider liking and subscribing, as it tells us you would like to see more videos and it helps the channel grow. See you next episode.